Welcome to this explainer. Look, if you're an advanced student of Koine Greek, a New Testament scholar, or a biblical linguist, you are in the exact right place. Today, we are diving into a rigorous, strictly empirical dissection of 1 John. Specifically, we're mapping out the discourse architecture of 1 John 1:6 through 2:2. Now, just to set the ground rules right away, we are completely bypassing any pastoral or homiletic applications today. Our focus is exclusively on technical text parsing. We're going to analyze the Greek text utilizing Systemic Functional Linguistics, SFL, alongside Constantine Campbell's spatial aspect theory. So here is our roadmap for this architectural dissection of the Koine Greek text. We'll kick things off with structural mapping, move into SFL metafunctions, trace out the cohesive infrastructure, and then apply the Campbell's spatial model to ultimately uncover the aspectual peaks of the discourse. And a quick warning up front. As we move through this, we are completely discarding legacy temporal parsing models. Okay, let's jump right into part 1, structural mapping. To really begin our empirical analysis, we have to index the discourse into discrete clause units using standard biblical verse notation. You'll notice how we index these clauses, like 1.6a, 1.6b, and 1.6c. Now pay close attention to how fronted marked themes shift the thematic focus and signal those crucial topic boundaries. For instance, in clause 1.6c, the prepositional adjunct antoiskote, in the darkness, is fronted. Why? To establish a stark thematic juxtaposition. We also start mapping the SFL process types here, where you can literally see the shift from a verbal process in the hypothetical frame of 1.6a straight into a material process of conduct in 1.6c. Let's move to our mid-level network now, section 2, and examine the SFL metafunctional features. Drilling into the ideational plane, there is a very sharp alternation happening right across clauses 1.6 and 1.7. We're looking at a tightly woven matrix that alternates between verbal processes of false claiming, like in 1.6a, and material processes of walking and cleansing, like peripatomen in 1.7a and katharize in 1.7d. The discourse is structuring a very sharp dualistic reality. It maps participant roles, like the implied we acting as the censor or actor, directly against divine participants who act as the absolute active agents of the material cleansing processes. Now, what's truly fascinating here is the interpersonal metafunction, specifically the rhetorical alternation we find in the mood selections. The author is using a highly sophisticated architectural pattern. We consistently see contingent subjunctives in the protases, which set up these hypothetical frames. Think 1.6a and 1.8a. But then those are immediately countered by absolute indicatives in the abidoses, such as the declarative moral evaluation pseudomatha in clause 1.6d. It's brilliant, really. It maps the authorial stance oscillating beautifully between contingent exploration and absolute theological certainty. Next up is section 3, where we trace the cohesive networks that bind this whole discourse together across the verse boundaries. When you trace the distinct lexical chains across this discourse, a clear escalating trajectory emerges in the truth and falsehood network. It starts off in 1.6d with a present behavioral state of lying. Then it intensifies in 1.8d to the internal absence of truth. And finally, it absolutely climaxes in clause 1.10c with a factative relational process, psevstin pumen ofton, literally assigning the attribute of liar directly to God. Structurally speaking, the text is held together by a highly precise logical conjunctured architecture. We absolutely must distinguish between the external plane conjunctions, like kai in 1.7d, which coordinates historical and real-world mechanics, and the internal plane conjunctions. The logical architecture leans heavily on these internal plane conjunctions. Specifically, you see the repeating an in 1.6a, 1.8a, and 1.10a. These are used to structure the rhetorical deductions that systematically dismantle the opponent's slogans. And that brings us to the micro level of our linguistic parsing. Constantine Campbell's verbal aspect spatial model. So, here is the absolute crucial point. We are completely rejecting temporal definitions of tense. Verbs in Koine Greek do not semantically encode time. It's just not there. Temporal reference is merely a pragmatic implicature. Instead, Koine Greek encodes a speaker's subjective spatial viewpoint. We're defining aspect entirely through spatial metaphors on an axis of proximity, meaning near to the speaker, and remoteness, meaning distant from the speaker. Let's make this unequivocally clear for everyone. We are explicitly rejecting the legacy past action with present results paradigm. Gone. We also entirely reject stative as a semantic aspect. Legacy temporal parsing is completely discarded here. In its place, we fully embrace the spatial axis. Perfective aspect represents spatial remoteness, and imperfective aspect represents spatial proximity. This creates the fundamental discourse grounding of our text. When we map this spatial axis directly onto our clauses, well, it changes everything. Aorist forms, like Ibermen and 1.6a, encode perfective aspect. Think of this as the helicopter view. It views the action externally and summary as a complete whole, placing it at a spatial remoteness to serve as the discourse background. In sharp contrast, present tense forms like pseudomata and 1.6d encode imperfective aspect. This is your street view. It views the action internally as unfolding, bringing it into immediate spatial proximity right in the foreground of the discourse. Now, for Section 5, let's see how this spatial mapping leads us directly to the structural climax, the aspectual peak of the text. Tracing the chronological discourse flow across our clause units, we can see the architecture building very deliberately. The sequence of arguments moves from remote hypothetical frames, those aorist baselines in 1.6a and 1.8a, right into the immediate spatial proximity of the opponent's present tense claims in 1.6b and 1.8b. But the entire discourse is hurtling toward a massive, sudden shift in clause 110b. To really understand that shift, we have to look at how Campbell's model defines the perfect tense form. It is definitely not past action with ongoing consequences. The perfect tense form encodes imperfective aspect combined with heightened proximity. It functions visually within the discourse like a spatial zoom or a magnifying glass, literally bringing the action into extreme immediate closeness to the speaker. And this brings us to the absolute aspectual peak of the text. Right here in clause 110b, the author deploys him articumen, a perfect active indicative. With this single selection, the author completely halts the baseline aorist and present flow of the text. This clause is the aspectual peak of the entire passage. I cannot stress this enough. This is not a past completed action. By selecting the perfect tense form, the author is executing a spatial zoom, aggressively intensifying the opponent's blasphemous claim of absolute immunity from sinning. The spatial closeness acts to magnify the theological arrogance of the claim right before the author delivers that devastating verdict in 110c. Now let's move to the next structural boundary to see how this resolves. Following that intense aspectual peak of 110b, clause 21a initiates an epistolary pivot. The author utilizes a marked vocative, tik neomu. This completely shifts the interpersonal frame from a first-person plural diatribe into a direct epistolary address. This structural pivot perfectly sets up the introduction of the Christological resolution in clause 21e, parakleton ekamen, placing the grammatical reality of the advocate in immediate present proximity. As you continue your own rigorous linguistic parsing of Koine Greek text, I want to leave you with this question to chew on. How does completely stripping away legacy time models and instead viewing grammatical architecture strictly through the spatial axis of proximity and remoteness permanently alter your empirical analysis? Because I promise you, when you stop looking for time and you start looking for the spatial zoom, the discourse structure reveals itself in incredible new dimensions. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing, and I'll catch you in the next one.